Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be at this very interesting meeting in a wonderful new building here. Absolutely splendid place. I'm going to be talking about the brain and creativity. A lot of the work that I did on this was done with Gustavo Dept, a theoretical physicist at Barcelona. Some of this work you'll be able to read about fairly soon in a new book called Brain, Computations and Connectivity, which will be published open access in about June, I'm pleased to say. The first thing I want to do is just to highlight the differences between brain computation and computation in a computer and AI. So the first thing to mention about the brain is that neurons operate by doing effectively an inner product or dot product computation. That is, each neuron has about 10,000 inputs to it, and the firing rates on each of those inputs are multiplied by the synaptic weights and produce an output of the neurons that then goes through a nonlinear function. So that's the style of brain computation. That means it's very good at detecting similarities. Effectively, every neuron is doing a correlation between its inputs and what it's already learned. Now I want to summarize, and this is in the new book, some of the key differences between computers and the real brain and AI. So the first thing I've mentioned already, brains use dot product similarity, effectively measure correlations. Computers use logic and NAND and OR. Brain cells have 10,000 inputs. Computer TTL has typically 4. Brain memory is content addressable. That is, you just provide the input and it looks up the right location in the memory. And I'll give you an idea of how that works in a moment. In computers, you access data by the address. Computers are not fault tolerant inherently. Brains are, because they're doing correlations, you see. So if a few of the inputs are not there, then the correlation is still reasonable. The brain is very low precision, whereas computers are high precision. Now, the most important point for this particular talk about creativity is the next one. Basically, neurons are very noisy. They generate noise because their firing threshold is where they're held, so that any small variation of the input can randomly make them jump up above a threshold. So for a given mean firing rate, and I'll show you a diagram that illustrates this, then the spike times of an individual neuron are maximally random. They're Poisson distributed, approximately. That means that if you have a population of neurons, it's going to show statistical fluctuations, and this is key to your decision-making. Your decision-making is probabilistic because of the noise in your brain, and I'm going to argue in this talk that that is key to creativity. So here's the sort of network which is characteristic of cortex of the brain. At the top, you'll see a set of neurons, those are the triangles, which are connected up to each other by recurrent collaterals, by connections that come around to the other members of the population to form an attractor network. It's got their excitatory connections, so this system is inherently unstable, but can maintain its activity so that you can maintain a short-term memory or a plan. Moreover, once you've trained the system up with, for example, lambda 1 inputs present simultaneously, just some of the synapses will modify by a local learning rule. The evidence for modifying the synapse is present at the presynaptic input and the postsynaptic input, completely different to deep learning. If you then apply lambda 2 inputs, you would set up a different subpopulation of neurons connected together. And then you have effectively 2 populations, each connected by strong positive synapses, each one of which at one time could be stable and firing, taking a decision, if you like. Inhibitory neurons, global, provide inhibition to stop the whole system blowing up. So we understand decision-making by applying lambda 1 or lambda 2 inputs simultaneously to a network. There is then noise generated by the random spiking times of the populations, which means on a given trial, if lambda 1 equals lambda 2, you choose one option on 50% of the trials and the other one on 50%. So that is why decision-making can be random in the brain. Of course, if lambda 1 is much bigger than lambda 2, you're more likely to choose lambda 1. So we set up formal models of how this works, and here's an example of a formal model which shows you that we model the neurons themselves as integrate and fire neurons, and you can see a neuron here with little fluctuations evident in its below threshold spiking threshold. And by chance, at some time, there'll be enough input to that neuron to make it emit a spike and then transmit to all the other neurons, the 10,000 other neurons it's connected to. So we make models like this. We also have the synaptic dynamics as well as the neuron dynamics. And then we have populations of neurons with excitatory cells and inhibitory neurons to keep it stable. We can then develop a nice model of decision-making, in which on the left, what I'm showing you is a neuron which wins when inputs are provided at time equals 2 seconds. And you'll see that one of our two populations of neurons starts to increase its firing rate. But because it's probabilistic, on some trials, you get the wrong decision. And that's what's shown on the right. And on the right, because the external inputs are slightly against the noise-driven decision, you'll see that the firing rates are less distinct for the two populations. So you can effectively read out your confidence in your decision by how far apart the firing rates are. Again, which is something that humans do very well. So that's an outline of how decision-making occurs in the brain. And what you'll notice is if you look at the bottom left, that the percentage correct just varies with the difference of these two inputs. So if they're equal, you're at 50%, and then you'll see that gradually, as you make the two inputs different, you choose a higher and higher percentage of the higher one. So that's how decision-making seems to work in the brain. Now I want to apply that to creativity. So what I want to argue is that noise in the brain is an important principle, not the only one, of human creativity, so stochastic dynamics. The theory is that noise in the brain, the stochastic dynamics I've talked about, promotes semi-random jumps to new locations in semantic networks. The jumps will be towards relatively nearby locations, basins, if you like, in the high-dimensional landscape, because they are associated together by coactivity of those populations during learning. Okay, that is then the key, I think, to creativity, that you're jumping in a noise-driven way in a semantic space. But of course, the jump you make may not be very useful. On most occasions, it will probably be a bad jump. So you then need, next, a reasoning system, a system that can ask you, is this a sensible new idea, a eureka moment, or not? So you have periods of random jumps followed then in humans by rational assessment of whether that was a good move to make. And that, I think, is the basis of much human creativity, whether it's in new painting, new music, or new ideas in science. Now we can test this sort of approach. We can ask whether creative individuals have more of this temporal variability. So I want to just finish my talk by showing you that we have done that. So what we can do with the bold signal in the brain that's shown here, what we get with functional magnetic resonance imaging, we can measure the correlation between the signals in each of a large number of brain areas, currently 360. And we can see that coalitions of brain areas may have high correlations for short periods. That means there's one subpopulation of your brain cells that's doing something. And then there's a transition to another subpopulation. and then to another subpopulation. And this goes on all the time. And to give you an idea of where we're going, what we discovered is that a standard model of creativity is correlated with how rapidly people transition from one of these states to another. So this slide just gives you an idea of how we measure the states. The next slide shows you that there are two sorts of temporal variability that we measure in the brain. One is the within-network variability. How much do the different brain areas that are in a particular coalition correlate with each other? And the other one is the correlation between different networks. How rapidly do all these systems keep switching? Now, what we showed in one paper with 574 participants, neuro-imaged, is that noise in the brain, in fact, or this ability to, in the resting state, to randomly transition between subsets of neurons, is correlated with the Torrance test of creative thinking. Now, the sort of test that goes into that, which is a highly validated test, is, for example, if you're given a cardboard box, what sort of things might you decide to generate with it? But it's a well-known test. So what we show here is that some parts of the brain, for example, the superior frontal cortex there, have a relatively high correlation in their noise-driven transitions with that measure of creative ability. So it's a special property of some brain regions that they're involved in creativity. So here's another analysis. This shows that the temporal variability of something called the default mode network, the thing that's normally happening when you don't have to do a task, is correlated there with this measure of creativity. And then lastly, if we look at the between network variability, we'll see that some parts of these networks, for example, transitions between the default mode network and a ventral attention network, how rapidly you transition between those is quite related to how creative you are. So that experiment then, which we did, actually then supports the idea, which I have described to you today, that noise in the brain is an important way in which we make interesting jumps in our semantic space to new places and get new ideas. Now, that's not traditionally used in AI approaches. In AI, the standard thing is to use noise to prevent you getting stuck in a basin of attraction, going to an energy minimum. So what I'm proposing to you today is something a bit different. Use a semantic space and make random jumps in that. And that, of course, could be adopted in AI in the future. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much, Edmund. Who out there has had a sufficient jump in their noise that they're ready to ask a creative question?
Thank you. That was fascinating and very cold. So, what can this tell us about the experience of creativity?
So there are certain brain systems that seem to come up into systems that we can report about, make declarations about. And one of those systems is the language system. So the default mode network that I showed you is connected into the language system. So this is actually another important difference between some forms of AI and human knowledge. We're able to provide reasons for the decisions that we have taken, and in AI systems, at least with deep learning, there is often no idea of how the system has come to the conclusion that it has reached. The whole issue, though, of consciousness is a key one in which we're all interested. My own theory of consciousness is it's related to the ability to have higher order thoughts about first order thoughts so that you can correct your thinking.
Any other questions?
Hi, yeah, thanks. Very interesting. With the all your individuals, you had 500 or so individuals. Was there any looking at how those individuals clustered based on what sort of types of job they did, or their age, that sort of thing?
No, we haven't done that. The Torrance measure, though, is correlated with some outcome measures. For example, with your success in your career and your creativity in your career. So it's not just a sort of random approach at creativity. It's been well validated. So at least we know that. Okay?
Thanks.
Have you done any studies on how much the noise in your brain is correlated with other things like decision making and more, I guess, math type of things? Because there's a model called a CVAE, which I don't know if you know about, which does input random noise, not as a way for regularization, but it has one part of the network, assumes it's a mean, and then randomly chooses something near it to go to the next part.
Yes, is noise really used in many different brain systems? And yes, it is. Basically, whenever you have an attractor network, then it's trying to fall into some basin of attraction using some input to it. And because of the inherent noise in the system, that's almost always going to be probabilistic. What we think, and this is work of particularly Gustavo Decker, the theoretical physicist, is that the brain is held very close to a critical set point. And so it's very close to a bifurcation of being stable versus unstable. And we think the reason that the brain is held exactly there is so that we do have probabilistic behaviors. In our book, The Noisy Brain, we first introduced these arguments, and we showed that this applies, for example, to avoiding a predator. The best thing to do is to make a totally random jump in the space. So yeah, I think this is used everywhere. One of the most amazing places where it's used is in our decision making between our emotional brain system, someone mentioned hot versus cold, and our rational brain system. So we have two completely different brain systems for evaluating what behaviors could be useful to the individual or to our genes. How do we decide between those? And what I'm suggesting is it's exactly the same process, that stochastic dynamics, if the two systems are about equal, and I've mentioned why they probably are in most of us, on how even that decision could be driven by noise. Okay?
I'm going to finish there, just so that we can move on. We may have time at the end to come back, but thank you very much, Edmund.